All right, guys. Welcome to another episode of Sales with Jay and Ron.
Hey, welcome. So today's topic, I think we're going to be touching on dispositions. So Ronnie, what do you feel like is important to know before you get started in dispositions to move a deal?
Yeah, so I guess the one of the first things you want to do is you want to make sure that you have solidified your buyers. Some people like buyers list. So essentially, for those who don't know, it's like you look into wholesale deals. A lot of the sales pitches like get a buyer's list of 1,000 names and blast it out to the list. I don't like doing that because I can't create a relationship with 1,000 people. What I try to do is I try to get three buyers in every market that I'm in. So three guys that I know for sure will buy the property. Three guys that are going to close on it. Three guys that are not going to be super conservative. Most of the time, they're going to be somewhat conservative, right? Because if they're ace buyers, they buy a lot. That means they're very careful. But these are the guys I can depend on. And if I decide to kind of go to the masses to try to get a higher price, that's different. But I want to make sure more than anything that if Jagger brings me a deal, that I can close that deal.
Sounds like having like a vetted buyers and, a few rather than, 1,000 on a list. Sounds like it's definitely more effective.
I think so. I've tried both. So just speaking from experience, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Another question I feel like, a lot of people in Dispo deal with, which I feel like is good for anybody getting into it, would be like once you have a deal under contract, what things can you say like you've learned or like a few takeaways that make it easier to move the deal?
Yeah. So number one is have good communication. If you're not the one doing the acquisitions, for example, me and you, right? Like you've moved on to fully taking on acquisitions alone. I'm doing dispositions alone, right? So I need to make sure that you know what I'm seeing and I need to see what you're seeing. So before you even lock up the deal, the first thing you want to make sure you're locked in with is in communication. Jagger tells me, hey, Ryan, I might have a deal in this area coming up. It's pretty hot, just a heads up. What I want to do now is even if he doesn't lock it up, the fact that he bought it to me, I want to make sure, okay, is this in a flood zone, right? Did Jagger miss this? Jagger, hey, make sure this is make sure you find out what the flood insurance is because this is in the flood zone. I know buyers are gonna ask me anyway, so let's get ahead of that. Right? Because I'm thinking what as a buyer, because we flip too, what do I want to know so I can close on this deal? So I can limit the obstacles to stop a buyer from buying this property, right? So I want to make sure that if Jagger's not asking certain questions, that I'm like, hey, can you ask this for me? Can you find this out? Oh, you know what's on a deal because of this. Don't even bother locking it up. Or hey, we need a lower number because of this. We have to adjust. So finding out those things and making sure you communicate is like the first thing you want to do. After that, now I want to start reaching out to these buyers and seeing if they're still buying, making sure. Um, of course, we don't want to disclose too much information, especially if we don't have it under contract. But I could kind of want to see, hey, it's in this area. Do you normally buy in this area? Are you still good to go? Hey, Ronnie, I got like 40 properties in the contract. I'm not the guy. Now I'm like, okay, I got to drop down to my number two and number three guy to make sure that they're ready to go. So when the deal gets signed, now I'm not scrambling. I've already kind of done a lot of pre-work. So now I'm like, hey Jagger, I already kind of have a buyer here. Let me send it out to them, see what they think. But I already have two guys that already told me they were interested that I know buy a 80-20 principle. 20% of my guys are buying 80% of our inventory.
Makes sense. You definitely gotta vet the people, make sure you know who you're going to potentially be working with before putting it out there because you just don't want to waste anybody's time for someone you know that's not interested. And I feel like another thing touching on the due diligence before you even lock it up is making sure whatever number the acquisitions person has it at, you can make sure you blast it out for more with a realistic possibility that other flippers will be interested. Not just blasting it out at a certain number, but just making sure that there'll be initial interest at the number you blasted out. I feel like is super key too.
Yeah, man, and that goes back to communication, right? Like I should, if you send me a deal to maybe underwrite, I underwrite it. It's with the expectation that the number I give you that you could probably lock it up at, right? If there's enough spread for me to blast it out. So that's number one. So once again, the acquisitions and dispo have to kind of, communication has to be airtight, right? Because we don't want our times wasted, right? So while if I tell you, hey, we can be at 100 and you get it at 100, there's no reason why I shouldn't be able to blast it at whatever, 110, 105, 115, but more than that 100, right? And if I don't, Now we have to figure out where was the lapse in communication. Did I tell you 120? And then you're like, Ronnie, but you said 120. What happened? Right now it's like an accountability thing.
Another question for, for people in Dispo, I feel like what characteristics do you feel like you need to have or skill set to be a successful disposition manager?
Communication, I think is number one. So, right, think about kind of the things that you're trying to do here. So, as Dispo, I need to introduce myself potentially to the seller, right, as a new person. So you have to be likable, right? Because now Jagger technically has to pass off that contact now to me. Jagger has built a ton of rapport with these people, and now I have to swoop in way less time in a more of a high pressure situation and ease that transition because now that they have to trust me. So that's number one. I have to now build trust with the buyers, right? They have to take my word for it. Tomorrow, I'm going to do a walkthrough in which the buyer is not going to be there. He's trusting me that if I tell him, hey, I did a final walkthrough, the property is vacant, he's taking my word for it, right? So that's a lot of responsibility. The third thing is I have to make sure now that the communication between the seller, the buyer, and title company is being streamlined, right? So of course we have a transaction coordinator, but I'm still kind of overseeing everything and making sure that everyone is communicating with the title company and everyone's pushing towards a close. And anyone who's done this before, it never goes as planned, right? Something always happens. So making sure you're vigilant, right? So you have to be super organized, and I fucking hate being organized. You have to be organized to be this person, and then communication has to be airtight with everybody, and expectations, which I don't know if you want to talk about, expectations need to be laid out. And every time I don't set expectations nice and clear, I always get burned, as we almost dealt with this last property.
Yeah, setting a clear expectation on the seller side, the buyer side, the transaction side. So I feel like there's three sets of expectations you need to set. Starts with the acquisition person setting the expectation on how the deal is going to go once they sign it, work them through how the closing is going to work, and then working them through who else is going to be involved in the transaction. And once you do a good job of that up front, then it gets passed off to the dispositions, who then has to do a good job of setting expectation of how the walkthroughs are going to go and the timeline of how that's going to happen. And then once we're going to have an answer for a yes or no if we can buy it, once we have our partners walk the property, then the dispo person also has to set an expectation with the potential buyers, making sure they understand the deal, what goes into it, and more importantly, what they need to do to make an offer for us to try to move the deal as a wholesale. And then the transaction side is making sure you're clear to the title company after we confirm we're going to buy it, and to the seller how the rest of the transaction is going to work. We could definitely do another episode on how the transactions go, but for the dispositions and sale side, it is probably the most important thing in a deal to set a clear expectation.
Yep.
I think that's pretty much it, guys. Well, thanks so much for listening and watching. If you have any questions or comments, please like or comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to
The boys is back.